As we said, we'll run through this presentation quickly, and then I will stop recording so that we can have some candid conversation. If you have just a logistics question or something really simple, feel free to interrupt me and ask. Otherwise, I'll go through this quickly and comprehensively so that we can get to the most fun part, which is talking with one another about this information. So what y'all asked for and what I agreed to is was to do a quick review of the proactive process. And what we mean by the proactive process is how the Women's Fund strategically positions ourselves to write and lead on a piece of legislation, right? So what ideas do we take? How do those ideas become laws? And, every step in between. So idea to law. It sounds so simple, but there are so many things in between. So here's just a brief look at some of the laws we've written. And I want to share this because though we are accomplished at it, we are also still reasonably new at this. Though very successful at it because we've never written a law that we haven't passed the same year that we wrote it. So some of the laws that we've written include eviction protections for victims of domestic violence, so that people who had to call the police to visit their residence could not then be evicted because the police had been called too many times, which is often written into housing agreements in public housing. Our marriage age and penalties for child marriage, forced marriage, and coerced marriage. This is the bill we talk about a lot. Post-conviction relief for victims of human trafficking, simply put, expungement opportunity for survivors of trafficking so that we can clear their records, they can clear their records to have access to things like employment, education, and housing. And this past year, the Good Samaritan protections for donors of menstrual hygiene products so that folks who donated period products weren't sued. So really, in the grand scheme of things, the Women's Fund has written from scratch 4 laws. We've supported countless laws and advocated for and worked on the amendments of and the refinement of but when it comes to taking things from start to finish, these are the 4 that we've done. And it all starts with an idea. And it's where do the ideas come from? Sometimes they come from community partners or allied organizations. When we were working on eviction protections and also when we were working on expungement and trafficking, some of those conversations really relied on Second Life or Street Grace, organizations that worked in trafficking. Some of our ideas come from individuals, and those individuals might be advocates, board members, impacted women, friends of friends, really anyone who says, here's a problem, no one is solving it, it is impacting women, and if they are anywhere in the net of the Women's Fund, we can hear those things and we can try to work to solve them. Some ideas come from alliances or coalitions. A huge part of our work, I would argue possibly one of the biggest parts of our advocacy work internally, is belonging to alliances and coalitions who work on different shared priorities, whether they are interpersonal violence, issues, period poverty, political representation. I mean, there is a laundry list. And so, for example, our bill this year was inspired by a conversation that was had on an Alliance for Period Supplies call, which is a national organization talking about the recurrence of manufacturers and distributors refusing to donate because of liability concerns. So we fixed it. And sometimes ideas come from the media, like Monica sharing that free from report with everyone Rachel sent out to y'all earlier in the year on the committee that really talked about the economic status of victims and survivors and how states were or were not protecting them. Things like that have great ideas and directly address policy changes. So there are no limits to where the ideas can come from. And that's important for you all to hear, because it means the most important thing is if you have an idea or you hear of an idea or you have a person or an organization with an idea, the most important thing is to get it back to the Women's Fund so we can start working on it. And so once we have an idea and we talk about it and we think about it and we talk about it some more and we think about it some more, and we're like, hey, this may be a good idea. What do we do? And really, there are two simultaneous things going on every time we evaluate an idea for, well, to determine whether it's necessary or even probable to be able to be implemented. We do a lot of research and we also do a lot of outreach. And these things happen hand in hand. It's not as if we do one and then the other. We go back and forth working on both of these. The one question that we do start with and we do research before any other conversations outside our organization is we determine what the current code is and what the landscape is for the kind of law that we would be talking about passing or the kind of policy that we would be talking about changing. And we do that to determine, one, if it's viable, or two, if it's necessary, right? Changing the law really is a last alternative if there is a way to make the impact or make the change without moving legislatively. But if we do dig into the code and we're like, wow, if we don't change this, an issue will persist, then we've basically said, yeah, there's a need for us to try to make a policy change. And once we've determined that there is in fact a need, we have to determine whether it's legal for us to make the change. We live in a state where, in particular, if we are talking about anything related to workers' rights or small business rights, there are preemptions that prohibit us from making some changes. And Tennessee is one of 5 states in the country with the highest number of preemptions. And what a preemption is when the state legislature has taken control of things that may otherwise be controlled by local districts. So when the state says, no, you can't do this locally, we are retaining that control for ourselves, it's considered a preemption. And we are in one of the states with the most preemptions. So while we're doing all of this research and determining, is there a need, is it even possible, we're also trying to do outreach into the community. We are contacting the organizations who work with the individuals who might be impacted by this. In the case of our period poverty work, we reach out to schools, we reach out to organizations like Girls Inc., like the Partnership in the Rape Crisis Center, Northside Neighborhood House. We talk to the people who are working with folks who need access or who need this law, or who need this thing changed, so that we understand how they are impacted and the scope of the impact. We're also simultaneously reaching out to our advocacy partners to see if they will join in with us to support the work that we're doing, because we are small and mighty here in Chattanooga, but if we're going to take something to Nashville and to our legislature, we need to make sure that we have statewide support from all of our allied organizations, or most of them. And that includes the Tennessee Women's Fund Alliance and the other women's funds, as well as issue-specific organizations, depending on what we're working on. We then talk to experts in the subject. Most of the time that includes reaching out to some academics. It's one of my favorite parts. And then we talk to some legislators who, and at this stage in our outreach, we're talking to legislators who we feel very confident will support the idea, so that they can give us their perspective. And as we talk to these people, and as we continue to do research, we're really answering the questions of what does a law need to include to be the most positively impactful? And a part of that is determining what do we need to make sure we don't accidentally include so that there is a negative impact of the law. And we're talking to the people that I call the implementers, right? So if this law were to pass, how would it be put into action? And making sure there's a viable action plan while weighing our pros and cons. So this research and outreach pattern typically takes the better part of a year. If, for example, someone came to me right now with a really great idea, it would test the capacity of the Women's Fund, and I think possibly overreach the capacity of the Women's Fund to turn it into something we could work with starting in November. It just takes time to have these conversations and to do the research right. Most ideas die in the research and outreach step. And it's for a lot of reasons. Often because there is a preemption, or because there isn't a viable way to implement an idea if we have it. Some of the ideas die because any way we craft the idea into a law, there isn't a viable path to pass that law, given the conversations and the understanding we've gained from opponents to the law and legislators who might be working on the law. Some ideas die in the outreach step because we realize that the organizations and individuals who could most be impacted by the law in a positive way have no interest in advocating or having conversations about the law. And if we can't get some of those stories in front of some of the people making the decisions, we're not going to be able to move it forward. Some ideas die slower deaths, like we work them all the way through the process and would keep working them. But most of them in this research and outreach step, there's something that makes it a not viable idea, a not realistic idea, or just an idea that has no path forward. But if an idea survives, that's when we dig in and we write the bill. And it is a whole new kind of research. The most important thing when you are writing a piece of legislation is to not recreate the wheel. So if a piece of legislation, if you're ever in a position to be writing a piece of legislation, the research starts with determining, does this law exist somewhere else? Is there something that mirrors this law in the Tennessee code already, right? So that is doing something similar, but possibly in a different area of the code. And if this law exists, or if there's something to mirror, how does it apply to the section of code that you want it to go in, right? So every law fits into a section of the code, and every section has its own definitions, and every section, has its own structure and organization. It's actually beautifully organized, but not always intuitive. I think that's the right way to say it, about where to find things. So in order to write something, you have to determine where will it fit in the code and what language is required to make it fit into that code. And then you start drafting and redrafting and drafting again a bill and running it past your trusted friends in the legal professions, and having other people who you trust that work in policy look at how it would align with the rest of the code. When you're deciding what language you want in your bill, you have to have a really deliberate strategy about what you want the bill to do. So, for example, an issue that I'm very happy to talk about publicly is sex ed. At the Women's Fund, we support the idea of comprehensive sex education. It is a controversial idea in Tennessee. And so our target in a large scale is we want comprehensive, medically accurate sex education in the state of Tennessee. If I make that whole ask when it comes to something we want to change about our family life curriculum, it's immediately going to get rejected. If my target as we are making incremental gains in changing sex education is, you know what, hey, we really want to see sexual assault education provided to students in Tennessee. We're going to go in with a first draft of the bill that is talking about sexual assault education in a really wide scope, lots of detail, recognizing that the target might be honed down, but our ultimate goal of getting what we want is going to be there. We're going to pass Aaron's Law or sexual assault education, but we often ask for more in our bill. So child marriage went from asking for 18 to compromising at 17, but then we got to add in the penalties for coerced marriage or forced marriage. So you think you finished writing a bill, but really what you're writing for is what you believe is your starting place to get what your minimum acceptable win is. So your bill typically reflects asking for far more than you think you can actually pass. But better to ask for more than ask for less and be disappointed. Finding a sponsor. So imagine we have somehow done the research, done the outreach, written a bill, feel really great about the bill. While we're writing the bill, we're also educating legislators with whom we have positive relationships in hopes that we'll be able to find a sponsor for our bill. Because no matter how well we do our work, if we can't find someone willing to sponsor it, it dies. And finding a sponsor is strategic, right? There are oftentimes lots of people who support the idea of a bill, but they may or may not be what I like to refer to as the powers that be in our legislature. They may or may not be the people sitting in a position of power to see a bill through to get it passed. So depending on the bill, you have to consider things like who has enough allies to make sure this bill passes, because your sponsor needs to be working the bill every bit as hard as all of you on our advocacy committee and all of our advocates and all of us on the staff and all of us on the board are. We have to have sponsors who will work a bill. So there's this fine balance. We've never had a bill at the Women's Fund where we have not had at least a dozen people where we can say 100% they will support the bill that we have written, but they aren't in the position of power to make sure that it passes. So there's a balance, right? The people who possibly support your bill the most vocally, from the most informed perspective, may not be the best sponsor. And there's a lot of weighing the powers that be versus your supporters. And there's a lot of investment in finding the right sponsor, because you typically have to lean in to the people who can see it pass and know that means that you are building a relationship of education and awareness with them around the issue so they can support it passionately enough and dedicatedly enough to see the bill through. Because once you found a first sponsor, you also have to find a second sponsor, right? You need a sponsor in the House and a sponsor in the Senate. And you need someone who is powerful enough in each chamber, and you need to make sure that your sponsors work well together. So it isn't enough to just ask for one or the other. And your strategy changes depending on what year you're looking for a sponsor, because our representatives in the House have a limited number of bills that they can sponsor in each 2-year session. So last year, it was really important to find a strong Senate sponsor when you were bringing a bill, because every representative was starting with their full number of bills that they can bring forward in the next 2 years. Right? So your first priority is finding the best Senate sponsor you can. This coming year, most of the representatives in the House have used at least half, typically more than half the number of bills that they can sponsor. So you've got to be digging in as early as September, starting to make sure you're finding a great House sponsor, because senators can sponsor an unlimited number of bills. So depending on the year, finding a sponsor is different. But the reality is you have to find two sponsors who work well together, who each have the individual positions of authority in their chambers to see something pass. Finding a sponsor, I would say, averages about 3 months for a bill to find a good sponsor. So presuming we're ready to move on bills, those conversations really do start here in the next few weeks. And once you find a sponsor, you have to negotiate your bill. And that means redrafting the bill again. So you have to go into your sponsor with a well-crafted, completely drafted bill so they know you're serious and competent and they understand the scope of what you're asking them to sponsor. However, he or she will always want to make the bill their own, right? Unless the idea is flawless. Ideas are not flawless. And that redrafting process is part of the where's your target, where's your ask, how much more are you asking for than you really think you need or that you anticipate getting, because you plan on redrafting the bill with your sponsor. And then with your other sponsor, and then getting the two sponsors to agree, and then taking it to legal services in the legislature. Our legislature has a legal services department. No matter how well we craft our bills, they then get sent to legal. And in my experience, they always at least make some little change to the bill that you submit to them. And then they have to approve the language for your sponsors. Hopefully we've done the homework right. It would be detrimental to our relationship with the sponsors that we have for a bill if we get to this point and they're agreeing to sponsor it, taking it to legal, and we miss something big and legal finds it, whether there's a preemption prohibiting it, whether it's duplicative, whether it conflicts with another area of the code that we didn't research. If we mess up those things, it undermines our position as a subject matter expert, as a reliable partner. And it's really our job to make sure that we've done all of those things correctly. So strategic, regular, dense communication is necessary. Over the years, we've developed relationships with some people who work in legal services in the legislature. And so without taking advantage of those relationships, we also have opportunities to reach out to them in the process and say, this is what I see off the top of your head, and am I missing anything? And they'll always make time for a well-informed ask. And so that helps. So assuming all these negotiations get done, yay, and we have a bill draft, and it's beautiful, and we are okay with where we're starting, and our sponsors are okay with where we're starting, and everyone understands what our minimum requirements are for the bill. We get that you may have to negotiate once you introduce the bill, but this is what we have to have. We are ready to go for the session. And hooray, we did it. If we can get there and our legislators can take a bill and introduce it in committee in the Senate or in subcommittee in the House and keep moving it through all of those places, then we do what we do, and we lobby and we advocate and we make phone calls and we have meetings. And back in the day when we met in person with postage and pens and postcards, we sent those too. and we see it through to pass. But the process is pretty circular. The research goes around in circles upon circles. The bill writing goes around in circles. The sponsor asks go around in circles. The negotiations go around in circles. And so what seems like a 6-slide, super easy process is actually kind of long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to stop recording.